Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely pumped to have you here today because we're diving into what is literally one of the most fascinating stories in all of human history. We're unpacking the incredible, centuries-long saga of human connection. Through trade, migration, the movement of capital, we're going to see exactly how our deeply interconnected modern society actually came to be. So, buckle up, we are looking at the making of a global world.
But hey, before we jump back in time, let me ask you about something you probably have sitting in your kitchen right now. Where did your potatoes really come from? Or your tomatoes? What about chilies? We always kind of think of globalization as this super recent phenomenon, right? Something born from the internet age or modern container shipping. But the wild truth is, these everyday foods only reached Asia and Europe after Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Globalization has actually been shaping what's on your dinner plate for hundreds of years.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The pre-modern global exchange. 2. The 19th century transformation. 3. The interwar economic crash. And 4. Rebuilding a globalized world. All right, let's start right at the beginning with Section 1, the pre-modern global exchange. A perfect example of this early connection? The Silk Routes. This is a massive board exam term, and for good reason. Think of these as the vibrant early arteries of global trade, connecting Asia with Europe and Northern Africa. But despite the name, they carried way more than just Chinese silk. They were literal highways for Indian textiles, exotic spices, and a huge flow of precious metals coming out of Europe. It was just this massive, ongoing exchange of both culture and goods. And what's really wild is how this totally rewired the global food exchange. When Columbus discovered the Americas, he didn't just find new land, he fundamentally rewired the human diet. Foods that were completely confined to the new Americas, things like soya, maize, tomatoes, chilies, and yep, our humble potato, suddenly crossed the ocean to the old world of Asia and Europe. It completely transformed how humanity ate. Now we have to note that this pre-modern global exchange also had a deeply tragic side. In the 16th century, as the Spanish and Portuguese began colonizing the Americas, they brought along a devastating, unconventional weapon: smallpox. Because Native American communities had absolutely zero immunity to this foreign disease, it decimated entire populations. It's a stark reminder that the early spread of globalization also paved the way for conquest through the terrifying spread of disease.
That brings us to Section 2, the 19th century transformation, spanning from 1815 to 1914.
To really grasp what happened in this century, you've got to understand the three distinct flows that completely rewired the global economy. First, you have the flow of trade. We're talking bulk goods like wheat. Second, the flow of labor, meaning the mass migration of human beings searching for work. And third, the flow of capital, which meant massive financial investment suddenly crossing borders. These three forces intertwined to create a truly interconnected world economy.
A brilliant example of this economic rewiring is what happened in Britain with the Corn Laws. These were British laws that heavily restricted food imports. So the crucial point is, when the British government finally abolished these laws, it triggered a massive ripple effect. Food imports suddenly got much cheaper, which, unfortunately, caused British agriculture to decline. But with that cheaper food, consumption absolutely boomed, fueling a massive, historic rise in British industrial growth.
And that perfectly illustrates the great paradox of the 19th century. On one hand, you have these rapid technological marvels. We get steamships, railways, the telegraph. We even get refrigerated ships. That meant perishable food like meat could be shipped from America and Australia all the way to Europe without spoiling, suddenly making meat affordable for the poor. It's incredible. But on the other hand, this expanding global trade came with a severe human cost. As European powers desperately sought more resources and markets, they brutally carved up the African continent at the 1885 Berlin Conference, an event notoriously known as the Scramble for Africa. Which leads us to a truly terrifying statistic: 90%. I want you to just let that number sink in for a second. During the 1890s, 90% is the death rate of African livestock during a single devastating plague.
This was the Rinderpest cattle plague, an infectious disease brought into Africa via imported, infected cattle. When it wiped out 90% of the livestock, it essentially destroyed the local African economy overnight. With their primary source of livelihood just completely gone, Africans were violently forced into the labor market working in mines and plantations for the European colonizers. It's a profound, heartbreaking example of how a biological disaster directly triggered a brutal economic shift.
And this insatiable need for massive amounts of agricultural labor across European colonies gave rise to our next concept, indentured labor. Often called a new system of slavery by historians, this was a massive system of bonded labor. Millions of Indian and Chinese workers were hired under highly restrictive contracts and shipped across the globe to work on plantations in places like the Caribbean, Mauritius, and Fiji. It was a massive, forced human migration that directly powered colonial expansion.
Let's move now into the 20th century with Section 3, the interwar economic crash.
Following the massive destruction of World War I, the very first modern industrial war, the U.S. economy actually recovered pretty quickly. And a huge part of that was the assembly line. Henry Ford famously adapted this mass production technique for his T-model Ford. But it was absolutely a double-edged sword. On one hand, productivity and efficiency went through the roof. On the other hand, the work became intensely repetitive, turning humans into cogs in a machine, which caused immense stress for the workers.
Let's move to and see how this builds into one of the most catastrophic economic events in all of history, the Great Depression of 1929. The devastating cascade really happened in 3 steps. Step 1, agricultural overproduction, meaning there was simply too much food, so prices fell. Step 2, panicking investors triggered the sudden withdrawal of U.S. loans from global markets. And Step 3, this caused a complete systemic failure. Banks collapsed globally, businesses shut down, and prices absolutely plummeted.
And because the world was so deeply interconnected by this point, the crash didn't just stay in America. India's trade volume took a brutal hit. Trade was essentially cut in half during the Depression. Exports and imports just tanked. And while agricultural prices fell rapidly, the British colonial government flat out refused to reduce taxes. This caused widespread, devastating distress among Indian peasants who simply could not pay.
Which brings us to our final section, rebuilding a globalized world.
In the aftermath of World War II, world leaders knew they had to stabilize things. Their solution was formed at Bretton Woods. This is a crucial concept to grasp. It's essentially the architectural foundation of our modern global economy. In 1944, leaders met at the Bretton Woods Conference specifically to establish new institutions that would ensure post-war global economic stability.
The results of that landmark conference are often called the Bretton Woods Twins. First, you have the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Its specific job was to manage global trade stability, dealing with the external surpluses and deficits of member nations. Then you have the World Bank, whose primary purpose was to finance the massive post-war reconstruction efforts. 2 distinct organizations cooperating to rebuild a shattered world.
But, the story doesn't just end neatly there. As we moved through the post-war era, decolonization swept across the globe. Many Asian and African nations finally gained their independence. But they quickly realized a pretty harsh truth. The IMF and World Bank were heavily dominated by Western powers. In response, these newly independent nations pushed back. They joined together to form the Group of 77, or G77, and they boldly demanded a new international economic order, the NIEO. Their goal was straightforward. They wanted real, actual control over their own natural resources, rather than having their economies dictated by Western financial dominance.
And that tension leads us right into the final historical pivot of our timeline. In 1944, Bretton Woods established a system of fixed exchange rates to keep currency stable. But by the 1970s, under immense economic pressure, that fixed system completely collapsed. This lack of restriction birthed the corporate globalization we recognize today. As the late 20th century approached, we saw the massive rise of multinational corporations, MNCs, who began shifting their production away from the West and into low-wage countries to maximize efficiency and profit. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly important question to ponder. How did that historic shift to multinational corporations moving production to low-wage countries like China shape the very device you are using to watch this explainer right now? Think about the phone or the computer screen you're looking at. The history of the Silk Roads, the brutal scramble for resources, the Great Depression, the collapse of post-war exchange rates, they all culminated to put that specific device right in your hands today. History isn't just in the past, guys. It is literally right in front of you. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer, and as always, keep learning.